The ballroom of the Hargrove Medical Foundation smelled like old money and fresh flowers. Gardenias, maybe, or something equally expensive that nobody could actually name. Chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the vaulted ceiling, scattering light across 500 people in black tie who had paid $10,000 a plate to be seen doing something charitable. Audrey Finch stood in the parking garage on the third level, hands gripping the cold concrete railing, and told herself she was ready. She wasn't sure she believed it. The invitation had come 3 weeks ago. Cream envelope, embossed letterhead. The Hargrove Medical Foundation Annual Gala. In honor of Dr. Owen Finch, this year's recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award. Her name had been added at the bottom in different ink, almost as an afterthought, and guessed. Owen had sent it himself. She knew his assistant's handwriting, had seen it on 1,000 memos over the 11 years she spent being his wife. Her sister Becca had called twice that night after the invitation arrived. "Don't go," Becca said the first time. "Audrey, I'm serious, don't go," she said the second. But Audrey had been doing things people told her not to do her entire life. She'd married Owen Finch at 29 when her mother said he was too ambitious, too cold, too focused on his career to ever really love someone. She'd quit her residency at 31 when Owen said having 2 doctors in the family was logistically complicated. She'd moved across the country to follow his research position, leaving behind her friendships, her colleagues, everything she'd built. She'd done all of it quietly, without complaint, because she believed in him. And then, at 38, she'd signed the divorce papers Owen's lawyer hand-delivered to her, while she was sitting in a hospital waiting room during her mother's bypass surgery. Not over the phone, not in person. During her mother's surgery. She hadn't cried then. She'd just folded the papers carefully, put them in her bag, and gone back to watching the double doors. She'd thought about that moment a lot in the past 2 years, about what it said about who Owen Finch really was. Not the brilliant surgeon the medical community adored, not the generous philanthropist whose name was on buildings, but the man who calculated that a hospital waiting room was the lowest resistance moment to serve divorce papers to a woman who had given up her career to support his. Audrey smoothed her dress, a deep cobalt blue, long, simple, nothing that announced itself, and picked up her clutch. She had RSVP'd yes. The thing about Owen was that he'd always been good at rooms. He walked into spaces and they rearranged themselves around him, subtly, the way furniture settles after a tremor. People turned toward him without realizing they'd turned. He was 6'2", silver at the temples now, with the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted whether he deserved to be somewhere. Audrey had spent years watching that happen and feeling proud of it. She understood now that pride had been a mistake. What she'd mistaken for love of him was closer to love of the idea of him. The version of Owen she'd spent 11 years helping construct, polishing, propping up. She'd been the silent scaffolding behind a building that had her name on none of its plaques. She didn't know any of this the night she first heard about the gala. What she knew was that her name had been on that invitation for a reason. Owen didn't do things without reasons. He was the most deliberately intentional man she had ever met, which had once been one of the things she loved about him. He sent that invitation because he wanted her there. And he wanted her there because he wanted to demonstrate something. She'd spent 3 weeks working out what. The answer, when it arrived, was almost elegant in its cruelty. He wanted her to see who she was now, reflected back in the light of who he was becoming. The Lifetime Achievement Award, the applause. His new partner, Dr. Meredith Lowe, younger, still practicing, everything Audrey had walked away from, standing beside him. He wanted Audrey Finch, former physician turned nobody, to sit in that ballroom and understand the transaction she had lost. She pulled her phone out and looked at a message she'd received that afternoon. "I'll be there at 8. Don't worry. CW. She smiled, put the phone away, and walked toward the elevator. The gala was already at full momentum by the time Audrey arrived. Waitstaff moved through the crowd with champagne glasses balanced on silver trays. At the far end of the ballroom, a string quartet played something tasteful and forgettable. Tables were draped in ivory linen, each centered with tall floral arrangements. White peonies and eucalyptus, the kind that photographs beautifully and means nothing. Audrey accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and found a position near the room's edge. She recognized faces. There was Dr. Harold Chen, chief of cardiology at University Medical, who used to come to their dinner parties and praise Owen's risotto while Audrey actually made it. There was Patricia Osei from the foundation board, who had stopped returning Audrey's calls about 6 months before the divorce, as though she'd somehow sensed the tectonic shift coming and quietly realigned herself. And there was Owen. He was across the room, near the main table, surrounded by a cluster of admirers. He was laughing at something. He had one hand resting at the small of Meredith Lowe's back, proprietorial, comfortable, not even conscious of the gesture. Meredith was in a champagne gown, dark-haired, poised, maybe 33. She looked the way Audrey had looked at 33, capable, optimistic, not yet aware of what she was walking into. Audrey felt a complicated thread of emotion tighten in her chest. Not jealousy, exactly. Something sadder and more textured than that. Owen saw her across the room. She watched his expression perform its calculations. Surprise first, then something colder, more satisfied. He'd wondered if she'd actually come. And here she was, alone, in a blue dress, holding sparkling water, surrounded by people who no longer looked at her with any particular interest. He had wanted this. She could see it clearly now. He had sent that invitation like a chess piece, and she had walked directly into it. He lifted his chin slightly in her direction. A greeting, minimal, as if she were a distant colleague, not a woman who had rewound her entire life for his. Audrey nodded back, and then she heard it, the faint shift in the room's acoustics that happened when someone was entering. A slight turn of heads, the kind of collective reorientation that didn't come from a single person, but from the arrival of a gravity field. She turned toward the entrance. Callum Rest walked into the Hargrove Foundation Gala, the way Callum Rest did everything. Without apparent effort, without announcing himself, and with the absolute certainty of a man who did not need the room's approval, because the room's opinion was largely shaped by him. He was 51, broad-shouldered, silver-haired in a different way than Owen, not distinguished silver, but weathered silver, the silver of someone who had actually lived through things. He wore a dark charcoal suit that fit the way only bespoke suits fit, and he walked the way people walk when they have never once had to negotiate their right to be somewhere. He was one of the most significant figures in American healthcare investment. His firm, Rest Capital Group, had funded 3 of the country's largest hospital network expansions in the past decade. He sat on the board of the National Medical Research Alliance, the Hargrove Foundation's new pediatric wing, the one whose ribbon cutting had been on the news last spring, had been built largely with money his firm had structured. More relevantly, the University Medical Center where Owen Finch worked, the institution that employed him, that named buildings after him, that was currently giving him a Lifetime Achievement Award, had just entered an 18-month contract renegotiation with Rest Capital Group over its research endowment. Owen Finch's career, at this particular moment in history, existed inside a sphere of financial gravity that Callum Rest controlled. This was something Audrey happened to know because she happened to have met Callum 11 months ago at a fundraiser in Boston through an old colleague from her residency days. They had talked for nearly 3 hours that night about medicine, about the healthcare system, about what had happened to her, about what it was like to rebuild something after losing what you thought was the foundation. He'd listened the way people rarely listened, without preparing his response while she was still talking. They had, over the following months, become something she didn't quite have a name for yet. Not romantic, exactly, or not only romantic, more like 2 people who had recognized something in each other and were moving carefully in the direction of finding out what it was. When she'd told him about the invitation, about why she was considering going, he'd been quiet for a long moment. "I'll be there," he said. "I have a foundation meeting that week anyway. Let me come." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said. "I want to." She had spent a long time after that call, sitting with the feeling of someone wanting to show up for her. It was a stranger feeling than it should have been. The room had noticed him. Of course it had. Patricia Osei was already moving in his direction, and Harold Chen had straightened his posture without visibly meaning to. There was a murmur of the kind of quiet recalibration that happens when someone enters a space who is more powerful than anyone already in it. Callum scanned the room once, found Audrey near the wall, and walked directly toward her. He didn't stop to shake hands. He didn't pause for the small negotiations of the receiving line. He walked to her like she was the only coordinate he had been navigating towards since he walked through the door, and when he reached her, he didn't say anything immediately. He just stood beside her for a moment, both of them looking out at the room together. "Nice flowers," he said. "Peonies," she said. "Or something adjacent. You okay?" "Getting there." He picked up a glass of champagne from a passing tray and handed it to her, taking her sparkling water in exchange and setting it on the nearest surface. The small transaction of it, the way he did it without asking, because he already knew she'd want the champagne by now, loosened something in her chest. She was aware that people were watching. She felt it without looking, the way you feel weather change before rain comes. Heads were turning with the careful nonchalance of people who did not want to be caught staring. She looked across the room and found Owen. He was still standing with Meredith, but he had gone very still. She could see the moment he had processed what he was looking at. Not just Audrey, no longer alone, no longer the quiet figure near the wall. Audrey, standing beside Callum Rest, in a way that was clearly not coincidental, clearly not professional, clearly something Callum had made no effort to disguise. The satisfaction on Owen's face from earlier was gone. In its place was something she'd rarely seen there, confusion. Owen Finch processed surprises slowly, because he so rarely encountered them. He was a man who moved through a world that largely behaved the way he expected it to. This did not. Meredith said something to him. He didn't respond. The dinner was structured to build toward the award presentation. There were remarks from the foundation chair, updates on the pediatric wing project, a video testimonial about lives, changed by the endowment funding. Audrey sat beside Callum at a table near the center of the room, where his place card had already been positioned before she arrived. She noted this, and thought again about the kind of planning that produced dinner tables arranged for your arrival. Owen and Meredith were 4 tables away, in Owen's sightline of her and Callum. The man to Callum's left was the foundation's executive director, a compact, nervous man named Jeffrey, who spent the first course trying to determine exactly how to address Callum, without saying anything that could be interpreted as over-familiarity. Callum was patient with him, in the way that powerful people are patient when they have already decided what kind of evening they're having. At some point during the second course, a woman Audrey vaguely recognized. Someone from the hospital board, she thought, appeared at her elbow. "Audrey," the woman said warmly, the kind of warmth that was really reconnaissance. "It's so lovely to see you. We hadn't expected. That is, we didn't know you'd be. Are you well?" "Very well," Audrey said. "Thank you." The woman's eyes traveled to Callum and became extremely interested in her own restraint. "Are you too?" she started. "I'm sorry," Callum said pleasantly, turning toward the woman, with a smile that was simultaneously warm and final. "I didn't catch your name." There was a pause in which the woman understood something had been communicated without a single rude word being said. "Margaret," she said. "Margaret Holst. I'm on the foundation board." "Of course," Callum said. "I've read your quarterly reports. Good work on the procurement restructure." He turned back to his food. Margaret Holst returned to her table, looking like someone who had entered a room expecting it to be empty. Audrey looked down at her plate to hide her expression. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "I was hungry," Callum said. The award presentation began after the dessert plates were cleared. The foundation chair, a tall woman named Diana, who had the precise diction of a former federal prosecutor, stepped to the podium and began the introduction. She spoke about Owen's surgical record, his research contributions, his work developing the minimally invasive cardiac protocol that had been adopted by 47 institutions nationwide. She spoke about his commitment to mentorship, his generosity with his time, his belief that medicine was a form of service. It was all accurate, Audrey thought. That was the thing about Owen. Everything true that people said about him was true. He was brilliant. He was accomplished. He had contributed genuinely to his field. He was also the man who had served her divorce papers during her mother's surgery, who had told her 2 weeks later that leaving medicine had been her choice, and he couldn't be held accountable for choices she made freely, who had removed her from the foundation's donor newsletter mailing list within 30 days of the divorce being finalized. Both things were true. That was what she'd had to learn to hold. Owen stood at the podium with the award, a crystal obelisk the size of a small child, and adjusted the microphone. The room was quiet and attentive. He thanked the foundation, his team, his mentors. He thanked the staff at University Medical. Then, in the particular pause that preceded what he wanted to make sure people noticed, he turned slightly toward Meredith's table. "And to the person who walks through every day with me," he said, "thank you for being my partner, in every sense." There was a sound from the room, appreciative, warm. Audrey heard it. She had expected to feel something sharp and terrible. A puncture wound, maybe. The specific pain of being unmade in public by someone who used to love you, or who you used to believe loved you. Instead, she felt something quieter. She thought about who she had been 11 years ago. A third-year resident who sometimes worked 30-hour shifts, and then went home and made dinner, because Owen's schedule was too demanding for domestic logistics. She thought about the years she'd spent studying the landscape of his ambitions, learning its terrain better than her own. She thought about the waiting room at Mercy General, and the cream envelope in her bag. Callum wasn't looking at Owen. He was looking at her. She could feel it before she turned. When she did turn, his expression was steady and unreadable in the way of someone who was reading something very clearly. "You okay?" he said very quietly. "Not for the room." "Yeah," she said, and surprised herself by meaning it. The moment that broke Owen Finch's evening was not the moment Audrey walked in. It was not the moment he processed who she was standing with. It was not even the dinner, where he had spent 3 courses watching Callum Rest refill his ex-wife's champagne glass, with a familiarity that was not accidental. It was after the ceremony, when Jeffrey, the Foundation's executive director, the nervous compact man, appeared at Owen's elbow with a manila folder and an expression that suggested he would have preferred to be having any other conversation. "Dr. Finch," Jeffrey said carefully, "I wanted to give you a heads up before you hear it from someone else. We received some preliminary feedback from the renegotiation team this afternoon." Owen turned from the conversation he was having. "What renegotiation?" "The endowment contract," Jeffrey said. "With Rest Capital." A fraction of stillness entered Owen's face. "What kind of feedback?" Jeffrey opened the folder slightly, then closed it, apparently deciding the document was not something he wanted to be holding during this conversation. "There are concerns about the research division overhead structure. Some questions about how the endowment allocation has been managed." "It's preliminary," he added quickly. "Nothing's been decided, but there's been a request for an independent audit before the renewal is signed." The word audit landed in the space between them. Owen was an extremely intelligent man. He did the calculations in approximately 4 seconds. The research endowment funded his department. His department's overhead structure was not, in certain of its details, something that would look uncomplicated under an audit. Nothing illegal, he was far too careful for that. But there were inefficiencies, arrangements, things that made sense in context, and would not make sense to someone looking for them from the outside. He had never imagined Rest Capital would look for them. The renewal had been considered routine. There had been no reason to expect otherwise. He looked across the room. Callum Rest was standing near the bar, saying something to Audrey that made her laugh. A real laugh, not a polite one, the kind of laugh that came from somewhere genuine. She had her head tilted slightly, and in the light she looked relaxed, in a way Owen had not seen her look in years. If he was honest, she looked like herself. A version of herself he had stopped seeing so gradually he hadn't noticed the vanishing. He understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that Callum Rest had not requested an audit as a gesture of retaliation or an orchestrated punishment. Callum Rest was simply the kind of person who, once he was closely associated with an institution, looked at it properly. He did that because it was how he operated. It was not personal, but the timing. Owen had spent 11 years learning to read rooms. He could read this one. He put his award down on the nearest table with more care than he felt. Meredith found him by the window 20 minutes later. She was a perceptive woman, genuinely bright, which was one of the things Owen had always cited when anyone raised an eyebrow about the relationship. She looked at his face, and then at the room, following the line of his sight to where Callum and Audrey were still talking, now joined by a small group of Foundation board members, who appeared to be telling Callum something they found very exciting. "Who is that?" Meredith asked. "Not about Callum. About Audrey." Owen didn't answer immediately. "Owen, my ex-wife," he said. Meredith was quiet for a moment. She's the one. Yes. Another quiet moment. And he's Callum Rest. Yes, the information moved across Meredith's face. She was 33, which meant she had been in medicine long enough to know what Callum Rest's name meant in the landscape of healthcare funding. She looked at Audrey again, and Audrey was laughing again, and Callum had one hand near the small of her back, not quite touching, but near and deliberate. "Did you know?" Meredith asked. "No," Owen said. Meredith nodded slowly. "You should talk to Jeffrey about the audit," she said. "Tonight before you leave. Don't let it sit over the weekend." It was good advice. It was, he recognized, the advice of someone practical and clear-headed, who understood how situations compounded if you let them. He thought about how often Audrey had given him advice like that, how often he had considered it administrative rather than indispensable. "I know," he said. Meredith went to find Jeffrey. Owen stood alone by the window and watched the room. Audrey did not seek Owen out that night. She had thought she might feel the need. Some compulsion to confront, to explain, to extract some acknowledgement from him. She'd been carrying the weight of the unsaid for 2 years. All the things she'd rehearsed in the car, and in the shower and in the moments before sleep, the precise and devastating sentences she would deploy if she ever had the chance. Standing in that ballroom, watching him understand what he had not anticipated, she found she had nothing left to say. Not because she'd forgiven him. She hadn't entirely. But forgiveness, she was learning, was less about the other person and more about what you were willing to keep carrying. Some things you could just set down, not for them, for yourself. Because the weight of it was costing you more than they deserved. She and Callum left at 10:30. The valet brought his car around. A black SUV, unremarkable, the choice of someone who didn't need to announce himself through his vehicle. She stood on the steps of the hotel in the night air, which had turned cool, and looked up at the building's facade with its lit windows and the faint sound of music still drifting from inside. "How do you feel?" Callum asked. She considered the question genuinely. "Like I stayed too long somewhere," she said. "And I finally left." He nodded. He didn't try to improve on that. In the car, heading back into the city, she was quiet for a while. The lights streaked past the windows. Callum drove without filling the silence with talk, which was one of the things she had noticed about him early on. His tolerance for quiet, his understanding that not every gap needed to be managed. "The audit," she said eventually. "That was already happening, wasn't it?" "It wasn't because of tonight. We've had concerns about the endowment structure for several months," Callum said. "It wasn't related to you." "I know," she said. "I wasn't. I'm not suggesting you did it for me." "I know you're not," he said. "I just wanted to be clear." She looked out the window. "Though I'll admit," he said after a moment, "I wasn't entirely unhappy about the timing." She laughed. It came out without calculation, loose and real, the way laughs sound when you're not performing them for anyone. She hadn't realized until she heard it how long it had been since she'd laughed like that. The audit ran for 14 weeks. The findings were not catastrophic for Owen, but they were not nothing. The overhead inefficiencies were documented. 3 arrangements with research vendors were flagged for restructuring. The contract renewal was delayed 7 months and renegotiated with significantly different terms. Owen retained his position. He was too established, too decorated, too valuable clinically to lose over administrative findings. But the process cost him capital, credibility with the board, some of the ease with which he'd previously moved through institutional decisions, a measure of the certainty he'd always carried about his own untouchability. Audrey heard about most of this secondhand through Becca, who heard it through a colleague, who heard it from someone at University Medical. She did not follow it closely. She had other things to follow. She had started consulting on healthcare policy with a nonprofit that worked on physician workforce issues, particularly the structural forces that pushed women out of medicine. It turned out that 11 years of watching the inside of those systems, even from an oblique angle, had made her knowledgeable in ways that were genuinely useful. She was not starting over. She realized, starting something that was only possible because of what she had survived. Callum came to her in January, not for a meeting, not because of any particular occasion, just because he wanted to, which was still a thing she was getting used to receiving without qualifying. They stood in the kitchen of her apartment in the early evening, making dinner with the easy navigation of 2 people who had learned each other's habits. And he said something about a building on the Massachusetts coast that he'd been thinking about for months, with good light and room for an office if she ever found herself wanting that. She didn't say yes immediately. She thought about it carefully, with the part of herself that had learned the cost of moving too quickly toward the shape of someone else's life. But she thought about it, and in the morning, she called Becca. "I'm going to look at a building," she said. There was a pause. "Just look," Becca said. Audrey thought about the peonies and the ballroom and Owen's face when the room reorganized itself in a direction he hadn't planned for. She thought about the audit and the delayed contract and the small, precise unraveling of certainties that had never actually been owed to him. She thought about standing on the hotel steps in the October air, the music fading behind her, and knowing she had finally stopped being somewhere she had outgrown. "Maybe a little more than that," she said.